Welcome, everybody, to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. Today, we have a conversation with Chris Gilbert and Cira Pascual Marquina. These are two comrades that we have interviewed a few times over the years, most of it on our audio platform, and we'll link those in the show description. They co-edited a couple books. I'm going to pull them up behind me. Well, I should correct that. I think they have co-edited a couple books, but in English, the one that they published was with Monthly Review Press, Venezuela, the Present as Struggle, Voices from the Bolivarian Revolution, which is a collection of, people from communes and different aspects of Venezuelan society talking about their context. It's a great book. I've done a study group on it before. And then I guess it was, was it 2 years ago now? Chris will correct me. Time just is crazy these days, but Commune or Nothing, Venezuela's Communal Movement and its Socialist Project, Chris Gilbert published also on Monthly Review Press. And today we're talking about a special issue on communes and socialist construction that is just coming out on Monthly Review, on the Monthly Review Journal, which people can check out at monthly.review.org if you are not already a subscriber. I'm going to bring them to the show just to have them kind of do a quick introduction of themselves, and then we'll get into this conversation. Cira, Chris, welcome. It's good to be with you both again. Do you want to take just a minute and kind of introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about the work that you do in Venezuela?
So I can go. Cira. I am an educator at a Communes school, basically. I'm a popular educator at El Panal. Our pluriversidad is our grassroots educational space. And I'm also a researcher. And together with Chris, we both work on a project that is called Cadre School, Escuela de Cuadros in Spanish, which is a Marxist educational space and podcast as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
I'm Chris Gilbert. I'm a professor of political studies at the Bolivarian University in Caracas. We've lived here about 20 years, and I would say that our main objective has been to participate in the Bolivarian Revolution, accompany it intellectually. Cira mentioned, and you mentioned some of our work. One thing we've been doing the last 4 or 5 years is research, traveling around the country to research communes. And Cira is presenting one of the several of the books we produced that exist in both Spanish and English.
Oh, awesome. That's great. I need to get a copy of those then. But I knew, that's why I said, caught myself, because I was like, I know that you have more work than what I have in my collection, but much appreciated. Appreciate all of the work that you do. I have learned a lot. I recommend these books constantly to folks who, are looking for real world, tangible examples today of how to think about socialism, socialist construction, what it might look like. And, I think that's one of the things that I wanted to bring up that you write in your introduction to this special edition of Monthly Review. You both write, quote, "We are convinced that the key reason that so much Marxism today has ceased to be revolutionary is precisely its divorce from revolutionary activity," end quote. And, you talk about the distance that so much of the kind of Marxist intellectual writing has from revolutionary movements of the global South, which represent the most advanced ones that we have, probably always in a lot of senses, as kind of you will talk about in your selection, Chris, too. But certainly today, as we see them as key sites of resistance to imperialism. And I wanted to kind of start there as a way for both of you to introduce this issue and talk a little bit about, what you're examining in this issue, as well as some of the topics that others cover in this special issue of Monthly Review.
Sure. The introduction to is polemical, and I think that I like to write polemically because I feel like if you're not denying something, you're probably not saying something. So, we pointed out, or that sentence you pointed to, where we say that that Marxism, a lot of Marxism has ceased to be revolutionary because it ceased to have contact or engage with revolutionary struggles. That sounds like a tautology in some ways, like saying Marxism isn't revolutionary because it isn't revolutionary, or some Marxism, is not revolutionary because it isn't revolutionary. But it's actually not tautological. As you were pointing out, what we're saying is that Marxism needs to engage with practice. And that's what Marx did. That's our argument. Marx engaged with revolutionary movements of his time. It was, he spent a lot of time, he devoted time and contributing to perhaps difficulty in finishing Capital was that he organized the First International. So, and the First International led up to the Paris Commune. And then, of course, great Marxists like Lenin engaged with revolutionary movement. I mean, that would be a vast understatement. And so one thing, when you read Lenin, if you people know Lenin's State and the Revolution, the last chapter is that he says he can't write the chapter because he has to go to do the revolution. I mean, there's such a world of difference between what you read, most of what you read, which comes out of academia. There's such a world of difference there. And it's not an individual failing. There is an element of individual failing. It's also about institutional structures. All these institutional structures, whether they're magazines or conferences or universities, are separated physically and by a lot of channels or lack of channels with real revolutionary movements. And that is, it's noticeable. It's noticeable the failure to address, in one, to put it briefly, the failure to express the consciousness of the principal contradiction, which is between imperialism and oppressed nations and imperialism and oppressed peoples. And one other thing is, like, I use the word Eurocentrism, though sometimes I like to say North-centrism, or it's complicated, right? Because part of the North-centric thing includes Australia probably too. But it's not just a question of Eurocentrism. It also, and this is more or less inevitable, but you can see how it happens. It becomes a kind of idealist Marxism, precisely because it doesn't connect with practice. And one expression of that, which is quite remarkable and problematic, is that, of course, Marxism is meant to have a critical value. You can, in some sense, take Marxism toward a revolutionary movement and use it to evaluate it critically. But there's also the other direction. I mean, Marxism should learn from revolutionary movements. And that second moment, which has been totally steamrolled in a lot of academic production, quite often is used to just throw away, to say, oh, this isn't right. We don't like the way these people are too militarist, or there's too much religion in what they do, or too much whatever. So they take distance, or it's too culturally different from us. So too often Marxism has become idealist in the sense that it's separated from the movement, and it's used simply to judge, or even worse, just throw out huge sectors of revolutionary movements. And one of the, to get away a little bit from Latin America, one of the huge examples of that is that there's a country of 1.4 billion people that's led by a communist party and says it's going towards communism. And there's a real failure to engage with that seriously. But coming to our context, so we wanted to do the opposite thing, and we've done that. I hope we've tried to do that, engage with the revolutionary movement in Venezuela. And this issue is just that we took the lead from the revolutionary movement in Venezuela in its present moment, in which communes had been taken to be the building block of socialism. And we've tried to look at that in this particular moment in history. At the same time, we understand that what's done in the global south, what's done in Venezuela, connects. It's part of a universal project of socialist construction. So we understand that things that happen here are isomorphic. They have connections with revolutionary movements elsewhere in the world. That's another thing that's important to overcome, is this kind of culturalism, which denies that there are universal elements, a universal project. After all, we're all struggling against capitalism. We should all be struggling against imperialism. So there should be these connections, shared elements among projects. So it's true that the project's inspired by the Venezuelan effort to build socialism with communes, but we also look at projects elsewhere in the world, China. There's contributions from Brazil, from India, and so that's what the issue is about.
Awesome, thank you.
So I'll be very brief, because you were asking about who had participated in the issue, and we will probably talk as we go through our conversation about some of the important pieces that have been put here. but I'll quickly go over it, and I'll go back to something that Jared said too. You can go to the monthly review page to either buy the issue, or actually the articles are also being released week by week. So there's articles by Prabhat and Utsa Paidnek. There's also an article by John Bellamy Foster, by Kalia Kuno, by Roberta Traspadini, by Sitsui and Laukinchi. There's also a beautiful piece, a selection of actually a text that was very important for Chavez, and therefore is very important for all of us who are committed to building communes, which is called the Report from Chilean Commune. He actually, Chavez, in the famous Golpe de Timón, strike at the home speech, he did a kind of like call to his ministers and really to everybody to read this text. So there's a section from it in this issue. We think that's an important excerpt. So those are some, but not all of the articles. So you can see that there's a wide perspective, as well as there's two interviews, one with which we will be talking about most likely, with Angel Prado, who is the Minister of Communes, and one with Joao Pedro Sterli, who's the founder and a leader of the MST, the Campesino Worker, the Revolutionary Campesino Organization of Brazil, which has some 1 to 3 million people participating in it. So there's a wide participation of folks who are working with people in different places of the world, thinking and to a certain degree kind of like working to build a socialist and what we would call also a communal world.
That's great. I mean, it's a great lineup of folks that you all have giving contributions, and from the pieces that I've read already in preparation for this, it's really great work. I know that, as I mentioned at the top, we've had a few conversations on our platform that I'll link over the years, talking a lot about the Venezuelan communes, and so we won't be able to replicate all of that in this discussion, and we'll link those so people can get more information, as well as to your other work. But I wanted to start, Cira, with something that you pose, which I think is just a great pedagogical, move on your part in doing an interview, not assuming that people have a lot of background knowledge. And you asked Angel Prado, who you interviewed, what is a Venezuelan commune? So let's just start there.
Well, basically, Angel, and then I'll add a little bit too from what we collectively are learning about building communes. Angel says that communes are grassroots organizations in specific territories. And he also says that they are self-governments where people basically structure legislation, internal legislation, administer resources, and manage means of production. So that is actually a very good synthesis of what a commune is. But of course, it's very packed with content. Basically, communes are the proposal that Chavez launches in 2009. Although long before that, there was a proposal for participative and protagonic democracy since the beginning of the Bolivarian process, really. And also in 2006, Chavez and the Bolivarian process, and the people of Venezuela begin to organize communal councils and simultaneously begin to talk about 21st century socialism. But the big question, with socialism being the objective, beginning in 2005, 2006, the question is how to get from here to there. We live in a capitalist society. How do we get to socialism? And basically, the commune is, I would say, at the very least, but I think a lot more than that, but at the very least, Venezuela's pathway towards socialism. But what does that actually mean? Well, basically, we probably all agree that to organize a socialist society, you actually need to reorganize the social relations, the economic, social relations in the whole society. How is that done in a commune? Well, yeah, indeed, communes are territories, like for instance, in my commune, in El Panal commune in 23 de Enero, there's about 10,000 people um, who decide the issues that pertain to their daily life in an assembly-based space through direct democracy. But not only that, communes should not only walk, the, let's say, should not only be focused on taking collective decisions in terms of how to solve their problems, which is important, like building a substantive democracy is not just collectively deciding, but also transforming precisely the relations of production. And we are talking about the reorganizing the economy, therefore. And how do communes, these spaces with 10,000 people in my commune, how do they begin to collectively reorganize the economy? Well, through means of production that are collectively owned. These kinds of means of production, they are called direct property, social direct property means of production. And basically, the means of production that communes have, and I should say that not all communes have collectively owned means of production. In fact, the majority do not yet have collectively owned means of production, and that has to happen. It's key that it happens if we really promote the reorganization of society. But in the case of communes that have means of production, the means of production, what is produced in the means of production, and especially the surplus, what happens with the surplus is collectively decided. The property is not, of course, private. It is not state, and it is also not cooperative. What does it mean? Then that the 10,000 people that live in El Panal commune, they are collectively the owners of the means of production, a textile plant, an industrial meat packing plant, a soap making plant. Those are actual means of production of El Panal commune. So this means of production belong to the people in those places. Therefore, there's no exploitation, and the surplus goes back to the whole of the community. So we can see there kind of like the base over which we propose to transform society. It's a substantive democracy that takes into account solving daily problems, but also reorganizing the whole of society. And I will say one last thing. Communes are actually, we have been traveling and we have been actually staying and working with many communes. Beyond being the communer of one specific commune, we have been working with many, many communes. And when you go to communes, you can see that in the worst of times, in the worst of times of the blockade, of the cruel sanctions against the Venezuelan people, people in communes do not assume themselves as victims, but as subjects of transformation. And I think this is very important. So you can see a horizon, an extraordinarily beautiful horizon that is being built up, but also you can see in the present solutions given to the problems of people through commune organization.
I think that's a really important point, and I know we'll talk about that a little bit more. And it reminds me a little bit of, in very different circumstances, but in the United States, sometimes when there is like a hurricane or something like this, then you will have a great coming together of people figuring out how to resolve issues that the state and the NGOs are not going to actually respond to or not respond adequately to. And you can see people change the kind of basic social relations that they would have with each other in that time of crisis. And certainly it's an opportunity that folks on the left often kind of try to lean into, right? Because it can be a space to reimagine and radically kind of transform some of those relations locally and build new cooperatives or ways of doing things. But obviously in Venezuela, you're doing that in a context where, as we'll talk to, there's already been a revolution. There's a state role going on, and then there's also the state's role in supporting the creation of these communes. And then you have these communal structures that are in place. And so there's kind of multiple tiers. And so, just to help people get an idea, I think that that's something that came to my mind. So in that same interview, Cira, you mention a, quote, synergistic relationship, end quote, between the government led by Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela and the communes. And you note in this in contrast to, quote, just 5 years ago, there were moments of marked tension and contradiction, end quote. This is something that Angel Prado, seems to agree with you on in his response. And he goes on to, talk about the anti-imperialist struggle in Venezuela, and, even cites the current context of Syria as a kind of cautionary tale that Venezuela must avoid. I wonder if you could both say a bit about this synergistic relationship that has kind of developed more deeply over the last 5 years, because when I remember, and we've had a few conversations over the years, but the first ones kind of on the heels of the book you wrote, Venezuela, the Present, a Struggle, there was a lot of, like, as you say, sort of tension and contradiction. It wasn't quite clear where this would go. There was, I think, a possibility that you both saw that maybe that relationship would become more and more antagonistic or more tense. And then you also saw possibilities and I think efforts again of people to take a kind of protagonistic stance on it and to sort of fight for ensuring that the communes had a really important role, or continued to have a really important role in the Venezuelan revolution. And so talk a little bit about what you have observed in terms of shifts and important developments in that area in recent years.
So communes began to take more force when things were really difficult, around 2016, 2017, when the US blockade really descended upon us very brutally, and there wasn't enough food to go around, and there weren't enough medicines to go around. And in that moment of nothing, people went back to comuna or nada, commune or nothing. They remembered what Chavez had said in his strike at the helm. And it became kind of like, it really became a roadmap for people, for many Chavistas. It actually became very actualized, the discourse and the idea, and actually the construction. So, but simultaneously, the government had to face this very, very difficult economic situation. And given the situation, the government had to take some processes in terms of liberalization of the economy. Of course, for those at the grassroots trying to build a new society, that doesn't exactly coincide with the hopes and with the horizons of people building communes. So that is a truth, and that's a fact. There were frictions between the grassroots movement and especially the communal movement, but in general between the grassroots movement and the government. I mean, I actually think that the government probably did not have another option, but the liberalization of the economy simultaneously is something that those at the grassroots, that communists or socialists, should also try to avoid. So very, very, very complex situation. What's happened is that basically we could say beginning around 2022, 21, 22, there's begun to be a shift towards the communes from the government. The government begins to again center the communes. The government never said no to the communes, but kind of was not very focused on the communal project. It was focused on the economic recovery of the Venezuelan economy. And so the government begins to focus more on communes. And we have seen this over the past 2 to 3 years, and especially over the past year and a half. So a first very important step is that that President Maduro began to promote consults in all the communes and communal circuits, which are communes to be. There are consults where people meet in assemblies. They decide what are their priorities in terms of stuff that has to be solved. Of course, you can imagine there are many, many problems that have to be dealt with in our society. Then there's a vote, and then the government delivers immediately after funding, a relatively small amount of funding, but important for the communes, $10,000. And then the commune itself, the people in the commune actually organized to solve whatever problem. So it could be a lighting issue or a water delivery issue or a school that needs a new roof or whatever you have there. And so it's the community itself solving these problems. This is very good because, of course, communities are know best what their problems are, and they can solve them more efficiently than the bureaucracy. But it is also even more important, I would say, because it promotes, encourages rather, those communes that are kind of like more incipient or newer communes that don't have such robust processes. It promotes their self-organization in assembly. So that's very important. And the last thing that's very important that's happened over the past year is that Ángel Prado, who we were talking about because of his interview, who is a communard from El Maizal commune, he's now the Minister of Commune. So that's no small thing. Actually, we've had ministers of commune since Chavez began to talk about communes in 2009, but we had never had a communard as a minister. So you can see that that's actually an important step. But actually, sorry, I was going to say that actually, I think that there's an important thing that Chris has been working on, which is the national horizon of the project, which actually comes together with this whole issue of the current turn towards communes. So I think it would be interesting to hear from Chris about that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm launching into the next, well, we're going to talk about my particular contribution a bit later, but one thing that the current, it was the current situation. We've been facing a very extreme imperialist set of attacks. I mean, the sanctions have been going on for almost 10 years, or in principle, Obama declared Venezuela to be an extraordinary and unusual threat 10 years ago. And so there's that, but then there's a real acceleration. Some of it's hard to see, but essentially behind the way U.S. imperialism supported the candidacy of Maria Corina Machado in the lead up to the election last year, and this is a very extreme situation, which also we saw a lot of intellectuals, the so-called left intellectuals from the global north, abandon the project. And so in that kind of situation, it reminded me actually of the moment in which we arrived in Venezuela 10, 20 years ago, in which the question of imperialism, that principal contradiction was quite evident. U.S. had engaged in wars or against Afghanistan and Iraq, and Bush II was in power. So that, again, there was this very extreme situation. And that kind of clarified things. It made it evident that one of the key contributions of the Bolivarian Revolution to kind of like the trajectory of Latin American socialist projects is this realization that, or rediscovery of the fact that you need to have a national horizon, a horizon of national liberation. And you can't leave the question of state power on the wayside. As Lenin said, the principal issue in any revolution is state power. I think Chavez understood that from the beginning. And that was a kind of, I think Chavez, you can see how Chavez emerges in a context in which there's a kind of dogma of movementismo, of which the most clear example in our context is Zapatismo, Neo-Zapatismo in Chiapas, which is an impressive movement, but it failed to project a national project. Not that it didn't completely try, but it failed to. Because of partly, but not entirely. And one has to always take account the indigenous issue there, which makes it a special situation in some ways. But it failed to project a national project and failed to address the issue of state power correctly. So in the introduction to the issue, we actually rely on a set of distinctions developed by Steve Elner, in which he talks about from above and from below. So the Venezuelan Revolution did work from the grassroots, did build popular power, but it also tried to coordinate that with state power, with a political intervention that seizes state power, and then you have somewhat transformed, that doesn't cease to be a problematic bourgeois state, but a somewhat transformed state in which there can be this kind of two-way connection between power from above and power from below. And it's true that when, even 5 years ago, that relation was considerably tensioned. But fortunately, through, I would say, self-critique, a kind of self-critique from both sides, that kind of alliance or that synergistic relation has been restored. And the truth is that a true revolution has lots of casualties. And I was just revising our work from 2020, Venezuela, the President's Struggle. And of course, one inevitably goes to there's a certain number of middle-class intellectuals there. And I was looking at approximately 4 of the interviews. Those people have gone over to a kind of left opposition, which then gets dangerously close to imperialism. But of course, the movement itself, the grassroots do not do that because it's not an option for them. So you can see how this, in this tension situation, of course, a middle-class sector will interpret the tension relation in a way that's problematic.
No, that's great. Thank you. All right, so we'll get into one of your pieces, or the piece that you wrote for this kind of solo authored, Chris. So this piece is called Socialist Communes and Anti-Imperialism, the Marxist Approach. And it starts with a bit of a kind of provocation about the role of communes in anti-imperialism. And I really appreciated this, right? Because it's also something that I kind of run into sometimes among Marxists in the core, which is unfortunate, but where they can be a bit dismissive of the kind of communal aspect because they focus so much on the on the state power question, and kind of see it as I don't know, but you kind of touch on some of the reasons why, some of which I think are legitimate, but also what is kind of different in the Venezuelan context, as well as some other contexts that you're looking at. And so, as you note, there can be communes in imperialist countries. There can be communes as part of a kind of settler colonial project, and that they may align with imperialism. And you can also have a commune in an anti-imperialist setting that ends up, kind of aligning against its own state, right? And so these are all possibilities, right? But you point out that, in our contexts, and I totally agree with you on this, the primary contradiction in this moment is quite clearly between imperialism and oppressed nations. I think people can perhaps best see this as the kind of, the sharp contradiction of U.S. imperialism and Zionism in, West Asia this year, most dramatically, of course, in Gaza, but also, Iran, Lebanon, what has happened in Syria, as well as, what's going on with Yemen as well. And so, they're in that context where people are thinking about oppressed nations versus imperialism. There can be this idea of being a little bit dismissive of communes, and you kind of deal with that, and you sort of talk about a set of conditions that are important to think about, and you go through, and I really appreciated this. You go through Marx, Rosa Luxemburg, Metzaros, who we've talked about before, along with Chavez, to kind of illustrate a theoretical apparatus that looks at communes as fulcrums of socialist construction, while highlighting the importance of national liberation and the importance of revolutionary parties and governments in defending communes. So can you just talk a little bit about the kind of theoretical? I know we're going to get a little bit into some of the examples as well, but sort of with the work that you're doing there.
Sure, that's very well said. I don't know if I need to say any more. I think you offered such a summary that I should just sign it or something. But sure, I want to say something about how I arrived at this question. I mean, I want, since the imperialist issue, in part because of the genocide in Gaza, but also the attacks on Venezuela, it was so central. It can't be avoided. It's one thing to say on paper, being honest about Maoists, that there's a primary contradiction, but it's another thing to see it in the, to see it in your daily life and to see it in the news every day. So we who've been studying communes for a while, it immediately became apparent that to me there's a need to address the question, like, when is a commune actually part of an anti-imperialist project and when not? And of course, you just have to look in West Asia to see an extreme example, where you have kibbutzim that claim to be socialist communes at a certain point. and they are on the wrong side. They're essentially part of a settler colonial project, which not only is it settler colonial, but it's also functional to imperialism. It's an imperialist outpost which accomplishes the strategic aims of U.S. imperialism in the region. But it's not. You don't have to look at situations that are as extreme as that. Also, you can see problematic projects because of an excessive autonomy. I mean, you might say zapatismo. I'm cautious to criticize zapatismo because I understand the complexity of the situation. Or another case was the Kurdish one, which again, I don't claim to be an expert in the Kurdish project, but there do seem to be serious problems with developing a national project of liberation, and there seem to be serious problems of guaranteeing that they're actually on the right side of an anti-imperialist project. So, given those complexities, and there's a third problematic one which is very obvious, but it actually was the last one that occurred to me, which is that all around the world, non-governmental organizations often prefer community-level projects. And precisely that is to avoid, like I was talking to a Senegalese woman, and she was saying that in Africa, it's quite common that they do that precisely to avoid the issue of land reform, precisely to avoid the issue of national sovereignty. So you have these examples, as you mentioned others, in which the communal projects are not necessarily revolutionary, not necessarily socialist. So the way I propose to respond to this question of when a commune is anti-imperialist, when it's part of a socialist anti-imperialist project, is by looking at Marx. I thought, what better method to look at Marx's discussions? But it's interesting, by posing that question that way, it led me to some, I believe, discoveries about Marx's approach to communes, because I think by posing the right question, it actually reveals some interesting things about Marxism that are not obvious in most of the readings of Marx. In the past, 30 or more years, 40 years, there's been a lot of interest in the late Marx, or the last Marx sometimes. The late Marx would be Marx from like 1870 forward, 1870 to 1870 to 1883. And then there's even a focus sometimes on the last three years. Marcela Musta wrote a book about the last 3 years of Marx. But often that approach to Marx shows some focus on one element, but not another element. For example, Koei Saito, the great Japanese Marxologist, he focused on the degrowth issue, that Marx, when he was looking at Marx at that last period, has an interest in communes, and the area that he focused on especially is Russia. And Koei Saito focused on the degrowth issue. He says that Marx became a degrowth communist. Or Kevin Anderson does work on that, but in at least his initial attempt to do so in Marx and the Margins, he drew a very narrow conclusion from Marx's work on the communes, which was that Marx did not have a unilinear view of history, that Marx accepted there could be a multilinear development in history. So what I think is, if you actually look at what Marx said about specifically the Russian commune, Marx looked at communal structures in Algeria and the Americas. He looked at Incan and Aztec civilizations. He looked in the village communities in India. But where he had the most information, he did the most study, is Russia. And that's where you get the exchanges with Vera Sasulik. He got a letter from Vera Sasulik and wrote a letter in response with many drafts. He also wrote a brief piece for a Russian journal that was never published, but it's existing as a work that he sent. It was never published by the journal. It was published later. So here's where you have a wealth of information. And when you actually look at it, what Marx is saying, Marx provides a schema in which the commune can actually function as a socialist project. He says it can be part of a socialist project, but it has to, for one, it can't be isolated. For another, we'll have to draw on the productive forces of the West, at that time the capitalist West. It would have to incorporate the developments of the capitalist West. But crucially, he also said that it would have to be part of a revolutionary project. He says, without a revolution, the Russian commune won't survive without a revolution. And that revolution actually happens in a dependent country. In contemporary language, it would be pretty clear that Russia had developed a dependent capitalism. And so it was somewhat similar. I wouldn't say Russia was dominated by imperialism. It was itself an imperialist country, but it was a dependent country. And so you can see how many of these things apply to national liberation projects today, like the idea that the commune would have to be incorporated in a strategic project with a national dimension is quite present in what Marx says about communes. But most people look at the late Marx, they're not interested in that. They're interested in some kind of ecological element or some kind of merely communitarian element. They don't look at these larger strategic questions that Marx points to. And then the second polemical thing that I discovered, like looking at the way people approach the late Marx, there's also this remarkable thing that has to do with marketing or something. Many people look at the late Marx and they say the undiscovered Marx, the new Marx. We've discovered a new Marx, a distinct Marx. And I guess that's to sell books partly, but it's actually a little bit more insidious than just selling books, because I think there's a continuous attempt to separate off a part of Marx from another part. And in this case, it's very similar to what happened with the young Marx. In the 1960s, there was the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844 came out, and people thought the young Marx was a more philosophical, anti-Stalinist Marx or something like that. And something quite similar has happened with the late Marx. The late Marx is the community-friendly Marx, the ecological Marx. And all those elements are there, but the point is you can't separate them from what Marx says earlier. So what I wanted to do was show how it's quite obvious if you actually look at Marx. The whole question of the commune does not emerge only in the late Marx. Not only is it the case that in the Grundrisse, which is written in 1857, Marx is talking about communes in the section called the Formen section, but it's also true that his critique of political economy leads into the question of communal production, because he juxtaposes commodity production for the market with the way production is done in communes. And so essentially he's laying, through the critique of political economy, he's laying the basis for his later embrace of communes as fulcrums of socialist development. But the important thing about that is that here we see how the commitment to communal production, the commitment to communes, is linked to the whole Marxist theoretical apparatus. And that Marxist theoretical apparatus also deals with social class. It also deals with the way capital gets concentrated towards monopoly formations and ultimately lends itself towards imperialist rivalry on the world market. So by connecting the communal issue with Marx's critique of political economy, you can see how the communal question has to be maintained, and Marx maintained it embedded in his critique of political economy, and therefore embedded in his critique of monopoly, and therefore in our time it would be embedded in critique of capitalism. So so essentially I'm saying that if we look at the late Marx, the way he actually treats communes, and if we also see how Marx's work as a whole, how Marx's work in the late Marx is connected to the critique of political economy, what we'll come to understand is that Marx's commitment to the commune is totally integrated in his commitment to what essentially is the imperialist dynamic and his opposition to the imperialist dynamic. It's a bit complicated because, of course, imperialism in the strict sense did not exist at the time of Marx, but there were tendencies toward imperialism, towards concentration of capital and monopoly, and Marx is fully conscious of that. So that's basically where asking this question, like, when is the commune actually part of an anti-imperialist project? By looking the way Marx treats it, Marx always treats communes as necessarily a commune that's going to be part of a socialist project. A meaningful socialist project will have to be connected to an anti-imperialist project of national liberation. And you can see that throughout his work. So that's why at the end of the essay, I asked the question, I posed the problematic cases, but actually if you look at the West Asian example, the example of Palestine, I would say it's not the kibbutzim, since the kibbutzim are totally on the wrong side of things. But actually Gaza, like Hamas around Gaza, is remarkably like the Paris Commune, essentially. People holding out for national liberation. That's what the Paris Commune was in large measure about, a project of national emancipation. And in fact, if you look at these, people might remember Marx had an infinite amount of venom for the Adolf Thiers, who was the representative of Versailles. Well, the Adolf Thiers of today is Benjamin Netanyahu, essentially a monstrous person who's not simply an outlier. He's also functional to an imperialist project. But this kind of juxtaposition between a people standing in a heroic way up for national liberation, on the other side, a kind of Versailles monstrosity on the other side, that's being played out in West Asia right now.
Absolutely. I think I really appreciate you naming that too, because I think like there's all these ways that people talk about Gaza and, just understanding it as a large, it is a commune in a lot of ways. It has been under siege, obviously, for, close to 20 years at this point. And obviously, most grotesquely with this war that comes about in response to October 7th. But yeah, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the kind of centrality you bring to that within this piece as well, because again, I think it's really important for us to be able to clearly connect these kinds of struggles. As you mentioned too, I didn't mention this in one of the questions, but you bring up Leila Khaled and her visiting the Venezuelan communes and offering her reflections. Maybe you could say just a little bit about that, Chris.
Sure, that was a wonderful moment. She came. It's interesting because she came here for a pro-Palestine, anti-fascist event, but on her own decision, she was spontaneously went to El Panal Commune, where Cira is a communard. And it was a remarkable thing but the remarkable thing is how there was just a total mutual understanding. The communards in the El Panal Commune completely understood the Palestinian struggle, completely identified with it, and vice versa. So we actually used a picture of Leila Khaled in front of a mural in El Panal Commune to illustrate the article. And I drew from, we actually had a chance to talk to her, to interview her briefly. And there's an article by Andrina Chavez Alaba in Venezuela Analysis that reflects some of those elements that she expressed there. So it's an interesting thing because you were saying many people might dismiss communes. I thought, I'm actually one of those people who thought, I ask these questions like, when is a commune important in an anti-imperialist? I take that question seriously because it's not a given. Those Marxists who are dismissive of communes, well, they might include me some of the time, so I think it's a serious question. And then you have this heroic Palestinian resistance fighter arrive to Caracas, and she says this is where it's happening. So that's certainly a wonderful illustration of that that there could be a commune that actually does oppose imperialism, does integrate into a project of national liberation, and curiously that's exactly what Marx was proposing.
Yeah, thank you. So you also write about Alvaro Garcia Linera and his interest in, late Marx's, his own late Marx's interest in Russian peasant communes, which he related to the Andean, is it IEU? Is that how you pronounce that? Yeah, community in Bolivia. So talk a little bit about them, and you also talk about MST as another related example. So just say a little bit about these examples and why you wanted to bring them in dialogue with each other as well as the Venezuelan communes in this piece.
Sure, I want to take a broader look at Latin America, and the Bolivian case is quite amazing. I mean, Marx was aware of ILUs, Rosa Luxemburg was aware of ILUs, and understood their potential as contributions to socialism. But when I think that Alvaro Garcia Linera has an interesting life. I think he was born around 1960. He studies mathematics in Mexico, and he returns from Mexico. He's a Bolivian, but he studies mathematics in the UNAM, I think. And then he returns to Bolivia with the desire of carrying out armed struggle, and he forms with a group of Mexican and principally Bolivian students. They form the Tupac Katari guerrilla army, which connects with Felipe Quispe's movement. Felipe Quispe is an Aymara leader in Bolivia, and together they form this guerrilla movement. I mean, what an amazing thing! This student, but they're impressive intellectuals because they're actually translating. They work to translate the Kowalski notebook from English to Spanish while they're in the armed struggle. That's fairly impressive. So they're quite aware of how this work by the late Marx connects to the Bolivian situation. Well, and then they end up in prison. The armed struggle doesn't get very far. But what is impressive about their armed struggle is not so much that they didn't, in terms of actions, they achieved very little, if almost nothing. But what is impressive is the aggressiveness with which the state attacked them. And I think what particularly struck fear in the state was that it was a movement. It's a combination of intellectual students who connected with an indigenous movement, and it was, on the one hand, it was capable to project a kind of national horizon, but it was also deeply rooted in indigenous struggles in Bolivia. So they end up in prison, and then Alvaro Garcia Linera comes out, he begins to teach, and is also a noted political commentator and journalist. And eventually he gets incorporated because in the mass movement, Evo Morales movement, because he's chosen as the vice presidential candidate. And then his years as the vice president of Bolivia go forward. But, Alvaro Garcia Linera's work is full of errors, like my work, probably. I think everybody who's connecting with the revolution makes errors. But since he's actually engaging with the revolution, he's also correcting, going as the revolution does self-critique, he's also doing self-critique. And his work represents a, what Lenin would say, a concrete analysis of a concrete situation. And so he sometimes in the 90s, he's cutting kind of close to autonomous theory. And some of the people in his group will turn into autonomous. Raquel Gutierrez turns into an autonomous intellectual, a kind of deeply problematic autonomous intellectual in my view. But Alvaro Garcia Linera sticks to the revolution and comes to understand that the commune is this kind of possibility of taking the Andean Ayllu community, which are indigenous communities that have existed for thousands of years. And they were part of the Incan Empire, though the way the Incan Empire worked was to subordinate them within a structure. But they were communal structures. He understands its potential, but he also, as time goes on, he realizes the increasingly need to give it, to understand it. He talks about the plebeian bloc, the need to incorporate it into a larger historical bloc that will do the revolution. And he completely understands the connection with state power, the way the communes will need to be coordinated with state power to be successful. So there's a real parallel, at least on an intellectual level, with what was going on in Venezuela. Unfortunately, because of lack of communication between Venezuela and Bolivia, I haven't seen those points of contact discussed sufficiently. Then I also turn to Brazil, and I look at somewhat more briefly at MST, because MST is the largest social movement in Latin America. I think the only rivals are movements in India. I think there's a peasant Kisan movement in India that might be larger. But MST is a movement that involves more than 1 million people, and their principal issue is land reform. But if you look at them, the whole question of land reform, and they take land reform by setting up communal arrangements. Like the first ones are called, the initial communal situation is called an assentamento, a settlement. An campamento. And then if they manage to make it more consolidated, legally recognized, it becomes an assentamento, a settlement. But they're fully conscious of how this is part of a huge project, land reform, that also is connected to the question of national sovereignty in Brazil. And one of my favorite, there's an interview with John Pedro in the issue, a separate interview. And one of my favorite things that John Pedro says, he's remarkably direct in a lot of senses. He says, that we're not going to win our battles because we have the right ideas or anything like that. We're going to win our battles because we have more people on our side. And so MST is an amazing movement because it just incorporates more and more people. I think that's an amazingly important thing, because I think Marxism in the West is so abstract. People love ideas, especially abstractions, but they forget that you need to have more people. And John Pedro and MST has done an amazing effort in incorporating more people. And then they also consistently project the national question. They were in great measure the organization that got Lula out of prison. Lula's an imperfect candidate, but he was facing fascism. So MST carried out a huge anti-fascist effort, but which involved getting Lula out of prison. So you can see how they are not a movement that closes its doors. They were born about the same time as Zapatismo. But whereas Zapatismo ended up more and more kind of closed in on its territory, MST has been more and more attempting to build alliances with urban sectors internationally and attempting to intervene in national politics in a very impressive way.
Yeah, thank you. All right. So I'm going to open it up a little bit to talk first about sanctions, because I want to do that, and then we can talk a little bit about some of the other topics that are in the issue as well. So I do want to definitely talk about the topic of sanctions in Venezuela. I'm really happy to hear, again, Cira, in your interview with Angel, him express that he feels the worst days of the economic war are now behind Venezuela. And again, that's great to hear. I do worry, as someone here in the U.S., obviously we don't want sanctions. U.S. sanctions are terrible kind of everywhere around the world that they exist. But I do worry about, Trump now being back in office, and particularly Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, who is, historically quite an antagonist to socialist movements, particularly in Latin America. And, of course, it's not just about the right. U.S. imperialism is quite bipartisan on these issues. As you mentioned, Obama, Chris, early on, started the sanctions in Venezuela, and certainly they have strong, systemic bipartisan support and for sanctions and antagonism to the Bolivarian revolution, specifically, but also really all other, left-leaning, movements across Latin America and across the world, really. And there have been recent efforts. We talked, about the election in Venezuela. I guess that was a year ago or so. There have been other efforts to, strangle or isolate or destabilize Venezuela. And so I'm curious kind of what your thoughts are on these issues today and where they sit. Obviously, there's an orientation that you all have, or the Venezuela also has, to these issues today. But I also am, think about what should our orientation be in the imperial core to these issues as well.
So yes, these are very important questions, actually, in terms of the U.S. siege on the people of Venezuela and our government. So here's what I think is important to say. Indeed, it is very possible that Trump and Rubio are going to put even more pressure. I mean, in fact, more pressure is already there because there have been already changes in terms of the license, of the Chevron license. So that's one thing that I should highlight. The change is already here. But then there are other things. Can we expect operations, irregular operations on our territory? I think that, of course, we've seen irregular operations on our territory, both with Democratic and Republican administrations. So we cannot say that would we be free from it. In fact, the last irregular military and U.S. subsidized happened with a Democratic administration. So we are under siege because imperialism operates in the same way in relation to the countries of the global south that seek to have sovereignty and build a socialist horizon. Well, of course, the sovereignty is enough for U.S. imperialism to attack. So there's that to take into account. I think that right now, as we look into the future, Venezuela is, even if the sanctions regime gets even more intensified, Venezuela is not going to go back into the worst of it. When it began, we were totally unprepared. The country was unprepared. There was no planification in terms of planning, in terms of what to do with oil. There are channels to sell oil now, like at discounted rates, but there are other channels to sell oil, Venezuelan oil, even though there are primary and secondary sanctions on Venezuela. So all this has to be taken into account when we look at the future. Of course, I think that for those of you in the imperial core, it is very important to make it be known what is the impact of the sanctions. The sanctions have killed tens of thousands of people, and millions of people have migrated have had to migrate because of the U.S. blockade on Venezuela. So the impact is truly dramatic, and I do think that those, like people in the global north, in the core, especially those who are, like aware of what the imperialism is about, it's not enough to say it. I mean, even I think that things as simple, which are totally not radical, but as writing letters to senators and congressmen, I actually do think that that's useful. The work that Code Pink does, which is along those lines, that is actually useful work, and people should be aware of the impact of the U.S. blockade. Now, what will happen? Will it be intensified or not? I cannot tell. I'm not sure at all about what's going to happen. What I do know is that not only does Venezuela have a better conditions to face sanctions as they may well re-intensify, because there's been channels, there's been processes, there is a real economic recovery. It is a economic recovery, I should say, in capitalistic terms. This should be said. The economic recovery has been in capitalistic terms. The communes are growing, but the communes' participation in the economy is very small still. This has to change. This is a pending task. But I would say that not only has the government found economic pathways to not be so to diminish the impact of the U.S. blockade, but also communes are more robust, and communes are in a very good space with the government. And this is actually very important as we face whatever may come in terms of the imperialist aggressions of the Trump and would-be aggressions on Venezuela. So that is what I would say. We are actually in better conditions to face it. We hope it will not be very highly intensified. We know that if it's more intensified, more and more people will die. But we also feel like we are in better conditions to face it. I think that almost any Chavista who you talk to would say that, would agree with in terms of this reading of what may happen if indeed there's a re-intensification of sanctions.
Yeah, thank you. Chris, anything to add on that?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that I mean, the sanctions are part of you can see that any country that raises its head, if it can't be defeated militarily, or if sometimes then the sanctions are applied. So it's part of the imperialist repertoire. It's like pillar number 2 of the imperialist repertoire. And so it should be something that's expected. If you look at Latin America right now in general, the situation is not great. It's not the worst. I mean, the Mexico is just, a solid government, net sovereign government in Mexico, and Petro certainly represents an advance in the return of Lula to power. But we're not in a great situation in the continent. Certainly, there's a lack of confidence and capacity to project. I think he had a whole axis of countries that were projecting a socialist horizon and consciously building continental integration, and 15 years ago, and we're not at that point right now. But I think though things, looking at the bigger picture, the global crisis will only get worse. That's what I believe. It will only get worse, and so we need to prepare ourselves. I think that that the condition of whatever advances in Latin America, as long as they're not revolutionary conditions, as long as they don't make advances towards revolutionary achievements, then we will face. I mean, that will be inadequate, because we're going to face a more and more profound crisis of capitalism worldwide, which necessarily expresses itself in a more extreme way in the global South.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things I was thinking about that I remember stories of, both from people who went down to Venezuela, but also I think from yourselves in one of the conversations that we had, was, during the periods of like really intense hyperinflation and like all the currency issues that were kind of coming about, where you had to exchange different currencies, and then there was attempts to, I think, create maybe I can't remember if Venezuela played with cryptocurrency a little bit, or but anyway, I'm just curious a little bit about that, because Cira, as you mentioned, it is there has been an economic recovery also in capital terms. Kind of how did that kind of seem to play out over time? To a place where things are a little bit more stable now.
So I think one thing about sanctions that should be understood is that, and we should recognize this as anti-imperialist and as socialist or communist. One of the objectives when the U.S. put sanctions on Venezuela or Cuba is actually to push towards normalization, capitalist normalization. So and I already said that the economic recovery in Venezuela has been an economic recovery in capitalist terms. So we should not, we have to, we cannot be said that people are living in better conditions. We simultaneously have to recognize that this capitalist normalization comes with what capitalism comes, which is inequality. I think that, as I said earlier, I actually don't think that the Venezuelan government had another option but to promote a sort of liberalization. And indeed, people are not skinny like they were, or actually dying like was happening, say, 6 or 7 or 8 years ago. So it was necessary. But now that we've come to this point, we also have to make sure that we begin to build with real steps the new model, our new model, which is the communes. Now that would actually mean funding means of production, funding so that communes can develop their own means of production, which will be the places where the new social relations will emerge. And of course, we cannot really make a rupture from imperialism if our economy is still a capitalist economy. We will continue to be dependent. So we need to we need to take serious steps towards building the communes and building socialism so that we really can take control of our sovereignty as a nation. I think that that's one important thing to highlight as we think about the future. And then there's other things. I mean, like there are also struggles that have to be fought within the Bolivarian revolution. There have to be struggles for the salary that have to be fought within. There have to be struggles that have to be fought for better healthcare because the blockade really damaged very severely the healthcare system. And that means, of course, that right now still the healthcare system has many problems. So those are struggles that we have to fight within the Bolivarian revolution, within the within the Chavista bloc, not from outside, but from within. Those are pendentas. I would say that as we look at the future, those would be the main issues. No, there's reivindications that we have to put forth right now. There are structural changes that have to happen through the communes, through more support. But then we also have to prepare ourselves for even military invasions. So there are a lot of areas that have to, I mean, like the working people have to be prepared for a military invasion too, because we cannot rule that out. Absolutely. I mean, we don't think that it's going to happen right away, but it could happen. And Chavez always talk about the union, like the civic military union. The people in the communes have to always be prepared also for the defense of the nation. So those are kind of like pending tasks as we look into the future. I guess I think that that's what I would have to say. Now, in terms of specific things that happen, the hyperinflation is not here yet. It's not here. It's over. I don't think it's going to come back either. But there's also been de facto dollarization of the economy. I mean, the economy got stabilized to a certain degree via de facto dollarization of the economy, and we are struggling for socialism and for sovereignty. Obviously, those are issues that we have to address. There have been different attempts, both in El Panal Commune and in the Che Guevara Commune, for instance, to make communal currencies. Those are important exercises, but they have been very small scale up to now. So we have to be extremely hardworking and extremely studious too, to be able to produce answers that will revert the situations that we are living and the ones that may come too.
I want to say something about picking up on your question, Jared, because when you mentioned the cryptomonedas, the crypto money, the cryptocurrency, sorry, there was a project here, the Petro. The Petro was it was quite a mysterious mysterious cryptocurrency because somehow it was connected to a barrel of petroleum. Cira and I actually each got half a Petro as part of our salary as university professors, which we later sold. But so there's been this whole history and there was actually the idea of returning to the Bolivar Oro, a bolivar that was based in gold, had a gold standard. I think that never went anywhere. I can say, so one of the things picking up on that, I think the Petro turned out to be a kind of chimera, didn't go anywhere. But it did accomplish something. One thing it accomplished is a way to not be overtly dollarizing the economy because you could calculate certain things in terms of petros instead of dollars. But what I want to say about that whole thing is that it's true that these were like the slings and arrows all of us suffered, because we saw the government trying out a million things, and a lot of them didn't work. And some of them even verged on the ridiculous, seemingly ridiculous. But in retrospect, and I say this by way of self-critique, in retrospect, the government did the right thing. The most important thing was to find a way of getting around the blockade and to try whatever. I think that's quite in the spirit of Lenin. If Lenin when Russia was under a kind of blockade and civil war, or the Soviet Union was under, he tried everything. They thought of selling part of Siberia to the United States. I mean, anything, concessions. I mean, the important thing was to survive. The important thing was to survive and maintain power. And the government did what it had to do through a series of creative moves. And some of them worked and some of them didn't work. I think that if you think about if you see other revolutions, like one of the reasons I think the Chinese Revolution is still here, is that they manage what people think of the agreements between Nixon and Mao. One way of seeing that is Mao discovered a way to end the blockade on China. So, because until then, China had been blockaded. It wasn't part of international commerce. So China overcomes the blockade. That makes a world of difference. And of course, it opens up, as Cira was pointing out, a huge can of worms, capitalist can of worms or something. But revolutions need to survive. And without overcoming this blockade in some way or another, you're not going to find a way forward. So I actually am thankful for even the experiments that didn't work or verged on the ridiculous that the government carried out to make it possible, because that lays the ground for going forward.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. Thank you. So let's just, before we close out, as we're kind of winding down, talk a little bit about some of the other topics, or, maybe, go into a little bit of detail about some of the discussions that are going on in the issue that we're talking about today of Monthly Review.
So I will go over a few of the articles just very briefly, because people should read them, and I'm sure I'll do a poor job of making a synthesis. But really, we are very happy because there's a great diversity, and they are articles, I think, they are articles that are also treated the theme very rigorously, and also with a commitment to transformation, which is basically what was our horizon when we were, as Chris was saying in the beginning, when we were working on this issue. We wanted to address the issue of communes in socialist revolutionary context, or in terms of socialism, from a Marxist perspective that was actually committed and linked with real revolutions or revolutionary movements. So I can begin with one of them, not in order. There's a book, there's an article by Kali Akuno, which is called The Theory and Practice of Cooperation Jackson. Most people who are listening probably know about Cooperation Jackson. And in this article, basically, Kali looks at the history and the different exercises of self-organization in Jackson and in the area where they work. So this is actually an interesting article, because it also looks at pending tasks. Like, it is always important for revolutionaries to look at pending tasks. So that's one article that I think is interesting. We have already talked about the interview that I did with Angel Prado, but there's also the interview with Joao Pedro Sterli, who with mentioning it. And I think that that's an important interview, because, of course, as Chris was saying, this is an enormous movement, an enormous revolutionary movement in Latin America that is not just focused on land reform. Absolutely not. I mean, that is kind of like the space from which they are battling against capitalism, but it is an anti-capitalist and also very definitely an anti-imperialist movement. So imagine thinking about, as I said, between 1 million at least, but some people say even up to 3 million, linked with the movement. Hearing from the person who is one of the leaders, the most visible leader of this movement, is important, I think, for revolutionaries. Then there's an article by Brian Napolitano, which is called "Charting a Communal Ecological Path." So basically, it basically centers the issue of of environmentalism from a revolutionary perspective, and an article by Roberta Traspadini, which is called Indigenous African and Peasant Histories and Collective Resistance. She deals with self-organized communities, Black communities, Cumbres, Quilombo kind of organizations, and what is left in the present, and also kind of the forms of oppression and domination that these communities face. I think it would be interesting to hear maybe from Chris about the Patnaik's article and also about John Bellamy Foster's article, which are really both of them are very important articles, I would say.
Sure. John Bellamy Foster wrote an article of Marx in the Communal Society, and it's a very profound article. He told me that it was he'd been thinking about it for a long time, and it represented work that he felt nobody had done. I think it's a very profound look at Marx's connection with communes and with the communal society. It's I would say ontological, like a social ontology. In some sense, there's like overlap between our articles. We cover some of the same texts. Both looking at the Grundrisse and, of course, Capital and the late Marx. But I think that I believe they complement each other. In some sense, mine is more purposely. My effort is trying to connect Marx to the current anti-imperialist struggle more directly. I think he's looking at a set of ontological questions that are, in some sense, more profound, more basic to Marx, but precisely for that reason, a little bit less matters of the daily news or whatever. And then, but I highly recommend it. I mean, of course, John Bellamy Foster is a very important Marxist, a very careful thinker, a great student of Marx. And I think anything he writes is going to be important. I think that's the case of this article. I think it represents truly new research. I've never seen, for example, anyone talk about such texts as the Critique of the Gaza Program in relation to communes. And then the Patnaiks, Utsa and Prabhat Patnaik. Their work is very important in the third world Marxist circles, and it's a huge achievement. They've co-written certain books about imperialism. I think Utsa's more the expert in the question of the peasant worker alliance and how that's taken up in global South context, which of course is important since many communes are rural communes in the global South, and Marx's own studies on rural communes, Marx's own study on communes actually is most focused on rural communes. So that the question of the worker-peasant alliance is very important. They have a very civic reading of the worker-peasant alliance, which points to certain customary approaches to the Leninist view are not adequate to the global South. Specifically, they think that the peasant sector of the peasant alliance, the worker-peasant alliance, has to be somewhat broader. You can't imagine that you'll get rid of the richer or middle peasants so quickly as Lenin thought. And then accompanying that, they see the importance of voluntary collectivization or voluntary cooperativism emerging among these peasant movements. This is all with a view to imperialism, because I think one of the key reasons they think that the worker-peasant alliance has to be more open and more and that is so important to maintain is precisely imperialism. Imperialism is not defeated in the global South through any stroke of the pen. It's a constant battle. So maintaining the worker-peasant alliance over the long durée becomes very important. And allowing for this voluntary collectivization to happen is one of the tactics that can be used to confront imperialism. So those are some of the contributions. I'm not saying they're the most important or the most exciting ones. There's also, and I want to mention also the Lau Ken-chi and Jade Setsui. They take a look at some existing communal structures in China, but I think it's very interesting because they have the ability. They speak Chinese. They are Chinese, so they actually can travel throughout China and visited these communes. One of them actually calls itself a people's commune. Still, it's like the last surviving people's commune in China. But more important than that is that in the last 10 to 15 years, China itself, because of government policy, has returned to what it calls communal governments in rural areas. So that's a hugely interesting movement towards which perhaps even parallels what's happening in Latin America. And of course it's a huge socialist communist movement. So the fact that they've turned as a matter of government policy towards communal governments in rural areas, I think that's the larger framework, which is the most interesting thing. In some ways, rolling back rolling back towards the era of the people's commune, of course, in a different way, in a complete transformed context. Oh, another person, sorry, I failed to mention someone who's also appeared on Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, which is Salvador Engel de Maura, who's really the expert in, he's really the expert in the environmental character of socialist farming. So he contributed a predictably erudite, impressive piece on taking these socialist farming projects as examples of communal farming, looking at their environmental impact with the rigor and knowledge that he always brings to the subject.
Actually, it's the issue is like almost 200 pages, so we have kind of like very quickly, I think, gone over all of the articles, but it is an issue that has a lot to give because of its level of rigor, but also I think the level of commitment too. So we are very happy with.
That's great. Yeah, I know that normally they're like 64 pages or something like that every month, and so this is a double expanded issue that you all have been able to do which they usually do one double issue a year. So
that's right. In August, July, August, the summer issue is a special longer issue.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. Folks can check that out at go to monthlyreview.org. Subscribe if you are not to the monthly review, or as you say, the articles will be posted on there kind of on a weekly basis. A few of them are up already, which is largely the work that I was referencing here in this conversation with you all. Before I do let you go, one of the things I also want to shout out is, although a separate project, is Venezuela Analysis, that I know both of you have contributed to quite a bit over the years. It is an independent media outlet in Venezuela covering, all of these issues. You all do interviews and things there. So that's also another platform that folks can support that I encourage people to do. Is there anything else that either of you want to say as you kind of close out?
Just following up on what you were saying, we were saying in the beginning of I'm sure in one of the books that we are definitely working on, these are the books on different communes. We have 10 books on different communes and grassroots organizations. The books are in Spanish mostly, and it's called Resistencia Comunal frente al bloqueo imperialista. And those who speak Spanish can go to the Observatorio Anti-Bloqueo, Observatorio Venezuelan Anti-Bloqueo, and download the books there. But actually, in the VA page, you can actually read all this content, not in book form, but all the content that gets published in these books of this collection that Chris and I have been working on for almost 5 years can be found there. So for those who are interested in hearing from the people who are building communes in their own voice, because this is testimonial work, this is a part of our work that is testimonial. Those who are interested in hearing from the people who are building communes, we really highly recommend that they do. People who build communes, they are, of course, they also build theory as they are building a new world. They are also thinkers. They build theory. They reflect. They tell you the story about how they've suffered the blockade, but they also tell you the story about how they are organized and how they think about the future. So I think that for those who are interested in the communal project and to hearing it from the people who are building it on the ground, we recommend this work.
Yeah, perhaps there's another discussion to have. We found it interesting. We found ourselves spontaneously doing these interviews and creating what's called testimonial literature in the tradition of Gilbert Chungora Barrios or Rigoberto Menchú, or June Nash did work like that, Miguel Bernet. We found ourselves spontaneously doing it, and we quickly realized that it was something that kind of the contrary of what academia doesn't have space for that kind of work now, because it's not interested in what people actually say and think. So that's an interesting, perhaps a subject for another program would be the question of testimonial literature. But before we leave, I want to say something that I wanted to say. It's great work you do here. Precisely the contrary of the work that I call, the North-centric or Eurocentric work, which turns its back on or fails to establish channels with real revolutionary work on the global south. So I want to say that it's exemplary work, that you keep a door open, you try to maintain those channels of communication to places where revolutions are actually happening, where people are actually confronting the principal contradiction.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for that. And certainly, it's something that is always an aspiration that we're trying to work towards, and it's it goes in fits and starts as all of this does. Um, but I agree. I mean, and as you were talking about these testimonials and all of this, getting the voices of people participating in these struggles and in the communes. That's one of the things that I really love about, for instance, this book, which, now is a few years old, the Venezuela, the President's Struggle. But even though like it's written, a few years ago, so in some senses it's written in probably some of the harsher periods of the blockade. So some of the contradictions that folks are talking about and dealing with have developed and changed through the processes that we've talked about today. Um, but it's great stuff, and I'm constantly in study groups with people. We deal with this. It's not just that a lot of the theory in the books are written in this kind of academic detached way in the global north, which is absolutely true, but there's a way that has also structured what people want to read or what people think is actually revolutionary or is most important to them, particularly people who are engaged in the academy in some level, whether grad students or things like this. But these are also people who, the ones that I talk to, are really care deeply about, changing the world. And I think it's, even among them, it's quite sad for me sometimes that people can be dismissive of, actual revolutionary thinkers, both in the present, but also even historically, not wanting to read, Marx or Lenin or Rosa Luxemburg or, Cabral or Nkrumah or, just different people who have wrestled with, real concrete projects and the actual contradictions. And I think that that's one of the things that I appreciate about both of your work. And I'm sure, as we've already alluded to, but I'm sure it's true within the body of the monthly review edition that we're talking about today, since it's something that you both highlighted in that first question that we talked about the need to really go to the places where people are engaged in these revolutionary projects and hear from them in terms of the their visions, their contradictions that they're dealing with, and also their voices, because I think so often you know we can get in this, as you said, this space of criticism or this isn't radical enough or so on. And a lot of times those people have that perspective as well, but they also have a perspective of we absolutely have to defend the gains that we have made. We absolutely have to defend the sovereignty of Venezuela, right? And so I think that is it can be quite illuminating to us, where I think sometimes in the global north, our impulse is to critique sort of the national project or, say the Maduro administration for not being as quote unquote revolutionary as we imagine. Right. And, when you hear from these voices on the ground, you hear, yeah, like, I don't agree with this policy, or I don't really know what's going on over here, or this is causing such and such an issue for us. But nonetheless, as we saw with the attempt to kind of undermine the electoral process, last year, like, these are the people who show up to actually defend, the Bolivarian project anytime that it is under imperial assault. And, we need to also take, especially in the core, that like, that's our responsibility, is to ensure that the whole project doesn't get smashed, and the sort of condition of possibility of these communal projects isn't destroyed, and so I think, anyways, I just appreciate all the work that you do on that and the way that you kind of deal with these different challenges.
Thanks a lot. I want to say one thing that just to resonate with what you were saying. The word critique. I've come to hate the word critique. I happily discovered that the original title of Marx's Sacred Family was was the critique of the critical critique or something. He was making fun of the idea of criticalness because the young Hegelians were critiquing everything. And I've come to hate the word critique because people say, they're critical Chavists. I'm proud to be a non-critical Chavist. I prefer to be a totally I'm not a critical Chavista. I'm an uncritical Chavista because I think that the only real critique is with the masses, when the masses themselves make a move forward. That's what meaningful critique is. So the whole notion of critique has turned into a kind of like, what should I say, lifestyle Marxism in certain contexts. And the only meaningful critique is when people organize and put forward a project or put forward an alternative.
Yeah, beautiful. All right, thank you so much for this. This has been another wonderful conversation with both of you. Shout out to all of your work, and I hope people go and check this out and check out the other stuff that you all are involved in and highlighting. So
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Jared. Really, it's been a good conversation.
Absolutely.